to check things. Can everyone hear us? Can anyone? Yeah, you can hear us on the online. Hello. Ooh, hi. Hi, everyone. My name's Mary. I run Lighthouse, and it is such a treat to have you all here tonight for another event for me, Ms. Florence Schechter, who is up for the Science Festival. So if you enjoyed tonight's show, you can get more of it with Leah Hazard talking about wombs tomorrow night. So do check that out. I'm going to give Florence a very quick introduction, and then you are going to put your hands together for an uproarious applause. And then she's going to do her thing, and then I'm going to ask some questions, and then you can ask some questions. Florence is, as you will all probably well know, the founder of the original, the only Vagina Museum. She has a background in science communication, as many of the terrible, wonderful puns in this book will evidence also a background in comedy. This is a very funny, very brilliant book which blends both of those two things beautifully, as does a background working on QI, which is again in this book in as much as she has both fascination and gift for little nuggets of information you just wouldn't find anywhere else. So she's going to blow all our minds with these delights. Will you all join me in giving Florence Schechter a very warm welcome? Hi, thank you all so much for coming. If anybody wants to come to the front, I promise I don't bite. No vagina dentata here. When I arrived here, we chatted about the format of the event. So I've got like this little presentation where I'm just going to chat to you a little bit about why I wrote the book. And I'm gonna, this is my like 1 hour talk, but I'm not gonna do the whole thing. So there's gonna be quite a few slides that I miss, and I'm just gonna say something really mysterious about what that slide is and actually tell you what it is. So if you want to ask later, good, that's a good little question for you to save up if you can't remember. So I wrote V because Penguin asked me to, is the honest truth. I founded the Vagina Museum in 2017 with a tweet. It's basically, I found out that there is a penis museum in Iceland, which is great, don't get me wrong, but there was no vagina equivalent anywhere in the world. And I was like, that's not very fair. And I was like, lol, we should totally make one. And I wrote down on Twitter, I didn't mean it. But then as soon as I tweeted it, I was like, oh my God, life goal attained. I'm going to do this. And that happened on the 20th of March, 2017. So we had our 6th birthday just like a couple of weeks ago. And we opened in Camden Market, and then Bethnal Green, and now we're looking for a place and a new venue, because unfortunately we're evicted, and I'll probably talk about more about that later. And I just wanted to share with you why I think the Vagina Museum is so important. So I'm going to read out some feedback cards that we got. Somebody, so at the Camden place, basically you could write down a little piece of card and give it to us about what you thought. Someone says, thought it was funny to come to a Vagina Museum. I actually thought it was super interesting and I learned a lot, which is a lot of people's like experience with it. They're like, oh, lol, like that was my experience setting it up. But it's actually had a huge effect on people. Someone said, I'm 39 and still learn stuff about my vagina. You know, like we were talking about just when you came in, like we are denied so much really, really basic knowledge about our bodies. And it's not fair. Somebody here wrote, as a woman who lost her ovaries to cancer at 14 along with my hair, the idea of feeling like a woman is something I struggled with in my late teens. Wish this was around then. And a lot of people came for a giggle, but made my day. And I think that really shows that, like, yeah, it's like funny on vaginas, but like it is really, really important, because our vaginas are a big part of our lives, whether we like it or not, you know. And I think what's really interesting about this feedback card actually is it shows how having these really rigid biological definitions around gender actually helps people as well. Like this woman lost her ovaries and she was suddenly like, oh my God, society thinks I'm not a woman anymore. Like, what does that mean? And yeah, just thought I think that's a really important point. So why does vulva shame exist? This is why I wrote this book, because there's so much shame out there, but I feel like I don't need to explain why there shouldn't be. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about why it exists, because I feel like I'm preaching to the converted. So obviously the patriarchy, and the patriarchy is all about, you know, making people, like I said, fit these really standard gender roles. And I could talk for hours and hours about that. It's also got to do with white supremacy. This is, I don't know if anyone recognizes this image. This is Sarah Bartman. Have you ever seen that photo of Kim Kardashian with like the champagne glass? That's a direct reference to Sarah Bartman, who, like, as you can see, she was very famous for having these really big buttocks because she comes from Southern Africa. Like at the time, South Africa didn't really like exist as a country, because this was in the like mid 1800s, I think. And she was stolen away from her family and everything, and she was toured around Europe by Belgian and British scientists to be like, oh my God, look at these like scary black people from Africa, they're very different to us. And the reason I bring her up is because when she died, her body was examined quite tragically by colonial scientists who used it as like proof that black people were inferior to white people. And one of the things that they said about her was that her vulva, her labia were very large, and this might actually be due to labial stretching, which is a common practice in parts of Africa. And they said because she has large labia, she's more promiscuous, therefore she is inferior. White women who have small labia are more chaste and therefore superior. So we're just seeing here, and this is something I mentioned in the book, about how cosmetic labiaplasties it's been exacerbated by mainstream online porn, but it actually has its origins all the way back in white supremacy. Vulva shame exists, as I said, also to do with online porn. If nobody knows who this company is, MindGeek. Anyone heard of MindGeek? Yeah, I know you have. Sorry, my friend is in the audience. My friends, they like will hear me do a talk, and then they'll be like, "Oh, you told me that fact over a drink last night." But yeah, I practice my talks on you, don't I? MindGeek is the company that owns all the free mainstream online porn, RedTube browsers, everything like that. If you want to learn more about them, listen to John Ronson's podcast, The Butterfly Effect. Anyway, but those are just a few things that contribute to vulval shame. There's obviously many, many different things. And we all sit at one, might say, an intersection of axes of power, which one might call, or as indeed Professor Crenshaw calls, intersectionality. So those are just three things, but I just wanted to make that point that vulval shame isn't just about the patriarchy. A lot of people spend time talking to me about misogyny, and I'm like, there's a lot more things going on here. Anyway, why is vulva stigma bad? I'm going to skip right through this because we all know why it's bad. But the point is that some people don't know that it's bad. Like there are people who disagree with us out there. And yeah, stigma causes vulval shame, which leads to things like us not being able to say the words. This is an art piece called Has Anybody Seen Mike Hunt? I talk about this art piece in the book if you want to read more about it. But not being able to say the word leads to, like, for example, something innocuous is the hashtag being shadow banned on Instagram. You might think, oh, what does it matter to social media? But people like the Eve Appeal, who, this is the post from them, they share, so the Eve Appeal is a gynecological cancer charity. They share life-saving information about cancer on the hashtag vagina. So it's really important that we're saying these words because it like literally saves lives when you say these words. I don't know if any of you are on TikTok, but I keep getting like recommended sex stuff, obviously, because of my job. And the number of people who are on like doing sex advice, and they're like, so you need to put your hand in her clam, and they're using all these like words because they can't say the actual words because they're losing it on TikTok. And then everyone in the comments is like, I have no idea what you're talking about. It leads to vulval shame leads to body dysmorphia. For example, this story arc in sex education, by the way, side note, Jean Milburn, Gillian Anderson, is canonically a member of the Vagina Museum because the set dressers on the show emailed me and were like, can we get some of your stuff so we can put it on her fridge? And you can see Vagina Museum postcards on Jean Milburn's fridge. And we also saw, oh my God, the artist who designed those postcards like freaks out. And we also sent a membership card. So she is officially a member of Christian Tree. And you can be too, so just think sounds fun. Sorry, I have to say that, although it gets to me. Anyway, it leads to sexual dissatisfaction, vulval shame. Stigma stops people from seeking medical help. It causes embarrassment, which means they don't go to the doctor. It leads people to using things like douches. These are some really horrible ads from the 1970s. It leads to not just patients being afraid to seek medical help, but also medical professionals being worse at their job. This is an object we have at the Vagina Museum that is a textbook for forensic science students. And it tells you how to tell the difference between a false virgin and a true virgin, where a false virgin is a woman who says she's a virgin, but she's lying to you. So a lot of these misconceptions, like a lot of this is happening because of the taboo that surrounds the vulva, because of that stigma, which then leads, I'm too passionate. Thank you. Which leads the medical profession even to buying into these myths. And stigma causes discrimination, obviously. For example, the whole tampon tax. We're in Scotland, first place in the world to provide free period products in all public buildings. Yay! But obviously was met with quite a lot of uproar with people who disagreed. Stigma also means that people can't do things like fight for abortion rights and reproductive justice, and all around the world we are seeing reproductive justice being rolled back. This person, Rakuten Shiko, she is a Japanese artist. That's her artist's name, pseudonym, which means good for nothing in Japanese. She was arrested in Japan for making art out of her vulva. And if you want to know more about that, read my book. This is a hot vulva shame means that even NASA is putting bad science in the world. If you want to find out about the Pioneer plaque and how they erased vaginas and vulvas, ask me in the Q&A section, because it's like a stupid story. Vulva shame leads to medical knowledge being erased. This is, as far as I can tell, if anyone can correct me, I would love to know, as far as I can tell, the earliest diagram of the internal clitoris in a medical textbook is from the 1860s. It was done by a German anatomist called Kobalt, who was a bit of a proto-feminist. I really like him. He's one of the few male doctors from the past I actually like. And the reason that I like him is because he said, and that's in German, so I'm translating. He said, if our medical textbooks were read by women, because of course they weren't at the time, because of sexism, they would be met with many a smiling countenance. And what he meant by that was, our anatomy textbooks are wrong, and you don't need to be a doctor to know that. You just need to have the parts to see how stupid this all is. And so he did some actual science on the internal clitoris, but obviously it never went past his work. Everybody looked at his work and was like, oh, that's not important, that's not relevant. It took until, does anyone know the year the first peer-reviewed study on the internal clitoris was done? 1998. Yeah. Yeah. I was like alive then. That's just so weird to me. How do we fight vulval stigma? Because I'm sorry if I've really depressed you right now. Like, oh my God, there's so much shame in the world and the shame is causing so much harm. Don't worry. We can do something about it. Number one, normalize vulvas. So a really good way to fight stigma is to just normalize something. I went to a talk for Pride Month a few years ago where a guy who was very involved in the campaign to legalise same-sex marriage in Ireland was speaking. And he said that within 20 years, the campaign managed to completely turn around people's opinions on same-sex marriage. And it was like, because it's within 20 years, that's like the same people who before would have said, no, I don't want to legalize same-sex marriage. 20 years later, the majority of people are going, yes, I would like to. We know this because there was a referendum. And he said that one of the major factors in this was just that more people came out, and that like gay people and LGBT people went from being this weird, scary abstract that you read about into the paper to like sue and accounting. And it's like very difficult to deny rights of sue and accounting than it is an abstract person. So normalizing is a really powerful tool. For example, the Swedish TV show Snoppen och Snippen, which is about a little penis and a vulva, which is for children. It's really fun, it's cute. Social media, like the Vulva Gallery. Art, like the Great Wall of Vagina by Jamie McCartney. TV, Call the Midwife. Anyone Call the Midwife fans? Oh, yeah, it's my favourite show. Whenever anyone asks me, what do you think is the best health comms project out there at the moment? I always say Call the Midwife. Everyone's like, oh, is it like the vaccine campaign or something? Like, no, just regular TV, because this is something that people actually care about, not like posters on the tube. And like Call the Midwife genuinely has been doing amazing stuff, and it was originally based off a book, which is like a diary of this woman's work in East London in the 50s. And then once they ran out of source material, they just kept going with it. And I think the BBC realised how much power they have, because they'll do an episode and then like the Daily Mail reports on it because it's a primetime TV show. And so if they do an episode like FGM, for example, suddenly that's like 5 million people in Britain who are then talking about FGM the next week. Like, and the BBC absolutely are taking advantage of this power, and I absolutely love them for it. You can fight it by also normalizing, like when we're talking about normalizing vulvas, I think it's really important that we normalize vulvas in an inclusive way as well. For example, by including trans people. This is a tweet about the Vagina Museum and how trans inclusive we are from Jay Hume, who is an amazing poet and also contributor in the book. You can read what he wrote in the book. You can do it by education. That's what we do. That's why the Vagina Museum exists. Fight vulva shame with education. For example, our viral knickers. Yes, a pair of my own knickers were on display in the Vagina Museum. Reading books. This is an extract from Our Bodies Ourselves, the groundbreaking 1980s health manual from the Boston Women's Collective. You can do education by art as well. Like this is Annie Sprinkle, who is a sex worker and performance artist, who did a performance art piece called, you'll love this, Public Cervix Announcement, where she invited people to come look at her cervix, because she was like, loads of people go their whole life without seeing a cervix, so I'm going to let them do that. And I think it's also really important, by the way, again, like we were talking about before, we need to do it inclusively. This education, we have to make sure that we're not perpetuating the same harms we're trying to fight. For example, like not erasing histories of marginalized people. So this was a thread that the Vagina Museum did about abortion, cesarean sections in Africa, because if you ask a medical historian who was the first person to successfully do a C-section in Africa, they might tell you James Barry, who was a really cool surgeon, also trans man, by the way, which is like really, really rare in history to actually know about some trans men. But he was the first white person to successfully do a C-section in Africa, and actually Indigenous Africans were doing it for hundreds of years before he came along. You can also fight it with activism, and I talk about that in my book. This is a little screen cap of the pages where I have a whole chapter about activism. So I just want to end again on some feedback. Hopefully I've done that fast enough. I'm a bit frantic, I'm sorry. With a feedback from something that someone wrote when they came to visit the Vagina Museum. She said, "Hi, I'm 11 and I came here today with my auntie. I feel like you never really get taught about things like this at school or anywhere really." Don't tell them. Because yeah, like we don't get taught these things, and we'll learn them from somewhere. So that's what we're doing. Someone also emailed the Vagina Museum. "Dear team, let me introduce myself to you. My name is newly refugee in the UK. I'm an Egyptian African feminist, and I love the idea of ethical gender in the Vagina Museum. My first time to see a museum for vagina works. I'm an FGM survivor, and my vagina for me is a part where I couldn't touch and became a part I started to discover and understand. The artwork you're exhibiting is totally beautiful and makes me appreciate and love my body, especially my body. Yeah, so like it's so powerful doing this stuff. Because sometimes people like laugh at the Vagina Museum, to be perfectly honest. Because they say like, oh, isn't that silly? But I hope in this very frantic, like 15 minutes, I have proved to you why learning about the vulva is so important. Thank you. Okay, I'll breathe now. So you can definitely. That was frantic and brilliant. I'm gonna put down on my Tuesday. Frantic and brilliant. As was the book, which you packed a lot into, and it says on it, it's like 14 plus. Yeah. My first draft was 90,000 words. It was now 50,000. It's what evidence it for. Yeah. Yeah, and you have a museum to put all the other work. Yeah. So when you say it's packed, yeah. And beautifully illustrated. And full of things that I felt first sort of uncomfortable about not knowing as an adult and someone with a vulva, and then angry, and then full circle just amused that now it's out there in the world, and clearly there is a generation of young people who are going to come up with books like yours and being like, oh, well, obviously we all know this now. So my first question is going to be about our trends of engagement. So in the book you have a lot of the language demystified, a lot of sort of a roadmap of what we are talking about and where. And for a lot of people, vagina is what we hear, and you turn around and go, it's not all about vagina, and vagina is not all about. And can you, for everyone in the room and online, tell us what you're talking about when you talk about B? Yeah, absolutely. Well, when you said terms of engagement, I was worried we were going to talk about like contracts or something. I was really worried. So basically, this whole book, and indeed the Vagina Museum, is about the whole gynecological anatomy. And there's just like beautiful drawings, indeed by Nadia, who I'm completely in love with. Oh, thank you. So this is the vulva, which is the external parts. As it was once described in Called Midwife, everything that touches your nipples is the vulva. And then we have the internal parts here, which you can see. So that's like the uterus, the ovaries, the clitoris, or most of the clitoris. And that's the internal parts. And there's no good word for the two of them together. There's only two possible contenders. One of them is cunt, but I just feel like that one might not take off as much as I want it to. And the other one is yoni. Yoni does mean both womb and vulva, but again, I don't think it's going to take off, mostly because of like the weird cultural appropriation bias from certain Californian women. So I feel like that's going to take off. So people for decades have been trying to find a word for the whole, kit and caboodle. And there have been quite a few contenders, of which I talk through in the book. That I talk about some of the words that people put forward, but the one that I decided to pick is B, which is really interesting because like when I said, I was a bit worried that people would like not know what I was talking about at first until I said it a few times. But I've seen so many people who are like, yeah, obviously, yeah, of course it's B. And I've even seen people on TikTok, like I said, because they can't say the words or they'll get banned, referring to it as the B anyway, without even my involvement. The B, it was meant to be. Yeah. Next up, the book is wonderfully inclusive. And from the way it includes queerdom, to just the way you navigate language and make it so simple that then turns around a lot of the hysteria that is around, here are all these words that are important to the way that we navigate feminism, the way that we talk about the experience of people who are oppressed by patriarchy. And if you rob us of this language, then what are we going to do? Good use of the word steering.
It's root and breed. Also in the book.
Yeah.
So what I was wondering is, when it comes to inclusive language, both when you were putting the book together and the Vagina Museum, what have you seen as the sort of greatest pushback? And what's the most effective way of getting people to sort of come around to like, here's language we can all use and it's going to be fun?
Okay, how do I answer this up? I'm opening a massive can of worms. So I say, so usually the way I describe it, there's 3 camps who don't like my work with Vagina Museum. And camp 1 is just like weird trolls who just want an opportunity to make a joke. And they're really easy to fight actually, because you just get in on the joke with them. And then they're like for example, we tweeted once, stop comparing us to Parliament, because everyone's like, oh, there's already a Vagina Museum, it's called the House of Lords. I said, stop comparing us to Parliament, vaginas are actually useful. And as soon as I tweeted that, a lot of those trolls were like, should get them. The second are the morality brigade, as I like to call them, who are the people who are like, can't talk about this in public, this is not for public eyes, it's something that should be shoved away. And then as soon as I start telling them things about how, a third of young women in Britain have not gone to their doctor with gynecological symptoms because they're too embarrassed, and that generally leads to things like cervical cancer being taught too late. As soon as you start telling them facts like that, they're like, oh, okay, I get it now. Yeah, I understand why this shouldn't be private knowledge. And then the third group is the trans folks, but honestly, I'm so tired. I don't want to go into it right now. No, I don't have time, because most of the time when a transphobe wants to talk about this stuff, it's in bad faith. And we've had people come into the Vagina Museum and look at a sign where it says, just so you know, we're being gender inclusive here. So we sometimes say the word woman, or sometimes say the word people with vagina. It depends on context. I have a explanatory note about this at the beginning of my book. People will sometimes read that and they'll go, oh, what does that mean? And all the volunteers and duty managers are like on guard, like, oh my God, we have to deal with like transphobic space. And then their friend will explain it. They'll be like, oh, well, it's it's trying to be inclusive of like trans men who menstruate, etc., etc. And then their friend will go, oh, thanks for explaining. And then they'll get on with their life. That's genuinely the vast majority of people in this country, I think. They either are fully supportive, or they just don't know and don't care. And it's very much like an Englishman's house is his castle. And the transphobes are a really tiny proportion. So,
well, I certainly felt after the book that there were a lot of really simple things, even though we are increasingly using this language here. But there was a lot that I felt like you can never get this a lot better in English. So thank you for putting it all in the book. I wanted to ask you about the vagina dialogues that are in it. Can you tell about some of the people you have vagina dialogues with, and why you picked those contributors, what they put to the table?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I knew that writing a book about me, I could only contribute so much. I could only write so much because I am me, I only have one experience. And there would be times in which I would talk about things because I feel like the readers, especially young readers, need to know about stuff, but I'm not the right person to talk about it. So I invited some people to write some short pieces about their experience. And I think I've got 7 in total, I think. And they are Dr. Ronks, who's so cool. And they wrote a bit about like the vulva and how to go to the doctor and knowing what your anatomy is called and health stuff, because they are a doctor. And they work in A&E, and if you go to A&E and you say like, oh, I've got pain in my vagina, and they start poking around inside, you're going to be really confused. They're like, oh, but that's not where the pain is, like over there. And that's because what you really should have said is vulva. But the doctors are just going off what you said. So that's why it's really, really important. Like, and that's why they're saying it from their perspective. You need to know your stuff. Then we had, I'm not going to be doing this in order because I don't think in order, but Eliza Rainbow, who talked about disability and sex, because I think that's really something like there's a UN report that only about 4% of people in any given year will have no health problems whatsoever. So talking about the intersection between disability and death is something that's really important to me. And so they wrote about it because they are indeed a sex educator and so. Then there's Jay Hume, who wrote about being a man with a vagina for the chapter about sex and gender. Amazon Letty, who is a Vietnamese American sports activist, who wrote about what it's like being queer and Asian, and like what is it like to navigate so many different intersections. There was Holly McNeish, thank you, who is a poet, and she wrote about being a master of language, about why it's so important to be using the right language, especially her experiences being a mother, and like what does she tell her daughter about her body. And then Hafsa Qureshi, who wrote about being an activist. Hafsa's a queer activist who is on the board for gendered intelligence and works with Stonewall, I think. And they wrote about how everyone can be an activist, yeah, even you. Thank you. Oh God, I hope that was all.
It's a great ones, and it's I enjoyed just the variety of voices and the way you brought them in, because it does feel like those are missed opportunities a lot of the time to sort of shine a light on those things that we can all learn from. So I have a few more questions, and then I'm going to pass it up to you because I'm sure you have many.
Very nice of them.
History. There's a lot of big history in this. There's battle vagina. There's vulvas in art history, and then you go all the way through to the Vienna tourist board getting an OnlyFans account in order to share the art that they have. Can you take us through a whirlwind tour? I know, and take a breath of maybe some highlights of what we can learn from the history of vulvas of the bead in art.
You don't know what you've asked me. It's that, being a museum director, obviously freaking love some history. Here's a fun fact for you, absolutely terrible fact actually. When I was starting the Vagina Museum, a man emailed me. I hate when that happens, but he said, I read about you wanted to start the Vagina Museum. I thought here were some things that might be of interest to you, and then he listed some pieces of like art and media and stuff that he thought would be of interest, including the vagina monologues. Like, I was starting a Vagina Museum and I'd never heard of the vagina monologues. I don't know what. Anyway, I was far too nice then. I would not be very nice now. I probably actually would have even replied, to be honest. But I said, thanks for the suggestions. I hadn't heard of all of these things, but I'll send them. And then he replied back and said, I thought of some other things to include. And I kid you not, I have a screenshot of this and I do it in my talk for Why the World Needs a Vagina Museum, because I could not believe he emailed this to me. He said that in my Vagina Museum, I should include, among other things, history. Like, just not like that was the whole bullet point. One of the other bullet points, and I promise you this is true, I will show you the receipts if you want. One of the other bullet points was information.
But he's engaging. The man who's engaging. Give him credit where credit is due.
Yeah. I really hope one day he comes to one of my talks and sees that screen grab of the email he sent to me and is like desperately embarrassed. But anyway, so some fun history facts about the vagina. How many are there? Yeah, number one, that the vagina has a vulva and a vulva. For most of history, probably has been venerated rather than shamed, taboo. And we know this because the oldest piece of art we have that represents a human is the Venus of Holofernes, which is found like near Austria in a cave. It's a tiny little figurine like this. And this person has a massive vulva. Like, it takes up probably a quarter of their body. It's huge and absolutely gorgeous. And this was made about 40,000 years ago, 30 to 40,000 years ago. The first penis that turns up in any kind of art is turns up about 10,000 years later. So for literally 10,000 years, we've got cave art all over the world. Vulvas everywhere. And it took 10,000 years for the human race to be like, oh yeah, maybe we should do penises too. And it's probably due to the reason we have the patriarchy, probably due to the invention of agriculture. And that's a whole theory that I'll get into maybe at another time, because I don't have time right now. But basically, but also it's not just the invention of agriculture, it's really to do with the accumulation of wealth that occurs when we have agriculture, because going from hunter-gatherer societies, where probably what happened is we had slightly patriarchal societies, because if you have a womb, you can like make a whole human. Like, I don't think you've ever like stopped to think about that. That's like insane. Like, that's so cool. Like, absolutely, completely fair if you do not want to use your womb to make babies. You're like, your womb, your choice, 100%. But the fact that they have the capacity to do that, like, I every time I think about it, I'm like, oh my gosh. And anyway, what is the only being in the world that can create another human other than the womb? A literal god. So obviously we were matriarchal, because they would look at our wombs and be like, you can create a whole human. You must be a god. There is no other explanation. Anyway, and then agriculture happened, which led to the possibility of the accumulation of wealth. So before hunter-gatherers, you eat off the, just eat what you get. With agriculture, you I said I wouldn't explain it, and here I am. You have grain, you store it for the winter. And now suddenly we have capitalism. Gross, disgusting. But what that means is that you suddenly are very concerned about who your children are, especially if those children are not coming out of you, but coming out of somebody else. And so you want to make sure that baby that you are giving your wealth to is definitely yours, because of like genes and evolution and whatever. You don't want to give your grain to somebody else's baby, because you're going to be further into somebody else's genes. So how do you make sure that baby coming out of that human is definitely yours? Enter the patriarchy. Things like valuing virginity, things like slut shaming, things like valuing youth in women, because especially as a 31-year-old woman, I now look at how I acted when I was like 17. I was like, oh yeah, I was really easy to manipulate. No wonder I got more male attention compared to now when I'm 31 and I don't give a fuck. And like, no man can tell me what to do and wouldn't bother. So anyway, yeah, my point is that vulvas are great.
I found it like, because the beginning of the book is very anatomical, as one might expect, and I don't like, clearly it was not obvious to this guy that you would know that history would be important to the Vagina Museum.
Yeah, I know. Museums, history, they've never been put together.
And yet, as the basic picture that I am, I got about halfway through and I was like, oh, there's a lot of history. There's a lot of art. There's a lot of like really cool facts about sort of true and funky drawings, and stuff that is useful in the pub, in an argument or in a conversation where you're like, let me tell you about this statue.
Yeah.
There's
so many good statues.
So many. So I'm conscious that you will have questions. So I'm gonna float one more from my end, because you brought up capitalism.
Oh, I'm sorry. I try to avoid it.
And you remind me what the name of the capitalism chapter is called?
Your vulva will never smell like a candle. Yeah. Of which I had to get legal to at Penguin to sign that off. They had to sign off that whole chapter. Yeah. They were like, really don't want Penny Culture to sue us. And now I know why. Oh my god, you're watching the track anyway.
So yes, so capitalism and vulvas and why it was important. That's a meaty chapter. So why was it important to make those connections that people, especially the youth, walk away with?
Yeah. So I don't know if you know this, but capitalism is ruining our lives.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we're all really understanding this now in a way that maybe like Karl Marx dreamed of, but never quite got people on board with. And yeah, it was really important to me because like I said at the beginning of my section, when we talk about vulva shame, people tend to focus a lot on misogyny and patriarchy, but capitalism is inextricably linked with misogyny and the patriarchy. And indeed, Friedrich Engels has a really interesting theory about how the patriarchy was actually also invented with capitalism. And that's like, again, that's a whole other kettle of fish. So yeah, that's why it was really important to me to write that chapter, because I wanted people to understand that is, oh, so much passion. That is a factor that is just as important to black factor. Yes, I was really worried that people would read that chapter and think it was about the feminine hygiene industry, and not get that actually at the root of that is capitalism, because you can have trade and an economy that is just and feminist, but it cannot be a capitalist economy.
Yeah, you go through the and that whole idea more solves the fact that self-cleaning anatomy is stinky and smelly and bad and all of these things. So do we have anyone in the room who has, yeah, oh my god, so straight up, go for it. Oh, I'm excited.
And modified and just like objectifying fetishes, and it's like what sort of like have that the light like and like how like sort of empowering the object and like the vulva, but also like trying to not sort of fetishize it properly.
That is a fascinating question, and I don't think devil's advocacy at all. And it's totally the kind of question that, like, as a feminist, I struggle with every day. Yeah, absolutely, because people ask these questions. They're like, when Kim Kardashian is putting a photo of her naked body on the internet, is it feminist because of this, or is it objectification? And that's a really difficult question to grapple with, and it's one that academics have been struggling with for decades. It's a really good question. I think the root of all of this is, where does the power lie? And so I'm going to use an example that's actually in the book, which is a painting called L'Origine du Monde by Gustave Courbet. Have you ever heard of it? It's oh god, I don't think I'm quick enough. If you want to, here, you try and search it. I don't think it's in there. If you we're all good. If you search Origin of the World, it should just come up Google Images. It's a painting that was in 1866 by French painter Gustave Courbet. It's literally of a person's body just from here to here. And you see the vulva, and it's just like full bush and one cheeky nip as well. And people, this is one of those paintings where people have questions. Is it empowering, or is it objectifying this person's body? Because obviously it is like the most ultimate objectification. She has no head and she has no arms, therefore she has no agency. We don't know who this person is. We don't know who the person's story is. All you see is just their body, raw meat. This is the painting. It's in Musée d'Orsay in Paris. It's really great as well, because it's like on the wall, and it's given loads of breathing room on the wall, and it's got like the light shining on it, and all the people that are walking past don't know it's there. They're just like, oh, seeing some nice old art in the French art museum. Oh my god, that's a whole vulva. Like they don't expect. Anyway, but on the other hand, it's got beautiful pubic hair, which was something that's very rare in Western art at the time. It's very unapologetic. It's called L'Origine du Monde, the origin of the world. It's so reverent. But at the end of the day, it was still painted by a man looking at like the male gaze cannot be taken out of this painting. So why not compare this to a painting by Micheline Thomas, an African-American lesbian painter who did exactly the same painting, but instead did it of herself. So she did a self-portrait in exactly the same composition. And would you say that's objectification? Almost definitely not, because it's of her own body. She's like reclaiming it. And why? Again, it's because she did it of herself, because she was the one who had the power. So it's all about asking yourself, who has power in this situation? And then you know the answer. Oh yeah, that's it. And that's Mickley Thomas's version. Very, very similar. You can say all the same things that you can say about l'origine du monde. The person has no head, etc. But because it's a portrait, completely different situation. Sometimes power, understanding who has the power in the situation is very difficult to understand, like with Kim Kardashian. Does she have the power in that situation? Sometimes no. So, you know, Britney Spears is a really good example. You know, who has the power in the situation? The answer is not always really obvious, but I think that's the question we should be asking. I hope that was, yeah. Thanks for asking. It's such an interesting question. Oh my god.
I just have like a fact question. You just
Ooh.
mentioned how the having people like for art is quite unusual and like it's called classically. Why is that?
Oh, talk about in the book.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically, firstly, it depends on where in art history we are. So in the Western canon, so if you asked a boring art historian, like what is art, that's the art I'm talking about when we talk about the Western canon, because also there are like lots of Western artists who have been marginalized and who aren't included in the conversation. Yeah, very, very rare. Now, big reason, because when people say, where's all the pubic hair in art, they usually mean that. They're not talking about like indigenous African art. They're not talking about Japanese sugar. They're not talking about like pots from Peru. The reason for that is in the Renaissance, fabulously rich people like the Medici's had so much money that they decided to patron artists like Botticelli, all those kind of people, led to this huge explosion of art. The Renaissance, the rebirth is what the word Renaissance means, and they were particularly inspired by the classics, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, because they were in Italy. They were uncovering all these beautiful statues from that time, and were really inspired by it, and look how beautiful it is. And they really grappled actually with the idea that the Greeks were pagans and they were like quite seriously Catholics, and how do we revere the body whilst also having the story of Adam and Eve. Anyway, so that's a side question. So they really revered them. They pulled out these white statues, and they based their art off of those paradigms. So these white statues had very blank bulb type vulvas, and they just recreated that. That was furthered by their Catholic values of women should be quiet, should not be sexual, should be chaste, etc., etc. So when you look at sleeping nudes, I have a whole talk about the brief history of vulvas in art, where I talk about the sleeping nude in quite a lot of detail. You know what I mean? Like, so women sleeping completely naked. In those situations, that's the perfect woman, because she's sleeping, she has no agency, and also she has no pubic hair on her vulva, implying that she's prepubescent and therefore like worthier, which is gross but true. So that's why they were doing that, because they were trying to perpetuate these ideal values of womanhood. What they didn't understand though was that the ancient Greek sculptures actually were all painted, and their bulby vulvas were actually probably had those hair painted on. That's why they were flat. But they didn't know that because the paint never went on. No problem. I'm looking back to the Q&A.
Do we have more questions in the room? I'm just going to also check online. It's not just me answering my message.
Oh, we live in the modern world.
Any online questions as well? Sorry, there we go. We've got stuff before.
I've got another question, sorry.
Oh, go for it.
But don't but I'm just curious how you got, like you're saying about yourself. How did you cut that down? And do you see
With so much crying.
like, do you see that? Because I know, like what you're saying, it's like fantasy. It feels like there's so much to talk about covers. Like, how do you do that?
Oh my god, yeah, there was so much. Entire chapters got cut. I was going to do a chapter about the history of science, where I was going to talk about that NASA thing, but I didn't even have time to talk about today. I was going to do a whole section about animal vulvas. There was so much, and also I just went into a lot of depth with stuff. And so if you ever read a footnote of, I could write a whole book about this, it's because my editor went, you do not need 4,000 words to talk about the effects of capitalism on vulvas. Please take it down to 500. And I was like, oh, okay. And the way she kept me happy was she put in the footnote being like, I could talk about this for days, but that's for another book. Yeah. And then my agent is also like, save stuff for the second book. So that's how I managed to do it. It was really painful. Yeah, there's like so much. There's just so much to talk about.
In the book, you say 2 vulvas are better than 1. Do you feel hopeful about sex education?
Yeah. I wasn't sure how those two connected, but sure. Do I feel hope?
2 things. That's in the section in the book.
It is.
It's weird, and like,
yes.
You don't usually have that sort of so effortlessly woven in. I think so.
Yeah. Two vulvas are absolutely necessary. Speaking as a bisexual woman, yeah, freaking love them. People ask me, but like, why you started the Vagina Museum? And I'm like, just love vulvas. Look at me. Anyway, am I hopeful about sex education? Depends. It depends. It depends on where in the world we're talking. I am not hopeful about the UK, especially because it feels like we're heading into another Section 28 for trans inclusion. Our government do not seem to be very interested in having inclusive sex education, which I find really depressing. So write to your MP if you want to stop that from happening. And again, yeah, there are definitely certain parts of the world, like you look at America. America is a cultural powerhouse, and the laws that they set really do influence the rest of the world. You look at how, like, Trump, when he was in power, how that bolstered dictators around the world. When America is passing laws, like you can't talk about trans stuff in schools, you see drag time story brunch protests happening in Bristol. Like they have an effect all over the world. So honestly, I'm not that hopeful, but I think the next generation is getting more radicalized because of the internet, and I'm hoping it's happening in the right direction, and I think it is. So I'm sorry to be that millennial who's like, Gen Z, please save us all.
If you're based in Edinburgh, I would highly recommend the Spit It Out Collective, who do a lot of cool stuff around consent and sex education, and not just in schools, but well beyond them. And they do stuff around transformative justice. They do the good stuff. Spit It Out Collective. There's another question. Thank you so much for the talk. Would love to hear more about the NASA Black story. Do you have time for the NASA Black story?
Just really, really quickly, the NASA Black story. Basically, go look up the Pioneer plaque. It was a plaque that NASA sent out into the universe with information about the Earth that was they hoped would be found by intelligent life somewhere, and it would guide them back to this planet. So there's like a diagram of the solar system, and it's like, go to this planet. This is where we are. And it's got all this like spacey information in, and they have a line drawing of 2 humans, because they're like, these are the animals that you need to speak to, and they have what they would call a man and a woman. It was NASA in like the 70s and whatever, and they quite specifically wanted them to be like pan-racial, so that if they accidentally land in Africa instead of New York, as they should, they would know still what humans to speak to. And the humans are naked, and also the man is standing very like confidently, and he's like this. And then the woman, she's like cocked her hip to the side, it's really funny. But she has like a barbed vulva, so she doesn't have what we would call a pudendal slit, which is the slit between our outer labia. And why that is is there's two different competing stories. And one day I'll have the money to like fly over to NASA and find out what the real story is. I'm not a journalist. One story is that NASA wanted the drawings to be inspired by classical Greek sculpture, which had the Barbie vulvas, which I think is a really stupid argument because like aliens know about art history. But what probably happened is actually it was drawn accurately by the artist, who by the way was a woman. And then NASA said, oh dear, it's the 1970s. That makes us really uncomfortable. Can you get rid of the slit? And so she did. She had to. And that's probably what happened. Is because I'm pretty sure like the reports say that she drew it accurately. And they told her to take the slit out. Which is so depressing because if the whole point of the backlight is aliens need to understand about our planet, isn't understanding how babies exit our body like a pretty important piece of information to understand like how the human race works? Because if they're like aliens and it's going to take them like 200 years to get here, you know, like understanding our reproductive cycles is really important. Oh, sorry. So the whole chapter that I was going to do about the history of science that I had to cut, I was going to call it "I'm worried aliens won't know how babies are made." that was what I was going to title the chapter. I was really happy.
Is it also true that you're drawing a machine with two people holding hands and they had to edit that out in case the aliens thought it was one person with both like a man and a woman were one being with like two heads?
I didn't know that. That's really cute. I think that's true. Because I know that's true for sharks. So basically, if the shark is trying to attack you, generally a really good strategy is to hold hands with your nearest diver, because the shark doesn't know like what humans are supposed to look like, so it thinks you're like one big weird sea creature with like aliens. And so then it will be really scared because you've essentially doubled your size. Now I don't know if I can take that. It's half that. Take that. So maybe not aliens, sharks.
The shit you learn from science.
Yeah, this is my whole life. It's just me at the pub going, did you know?
Do we have any last burning questions in the room?
Yeah. If it's burning, see a doctor. Sorry. Yes, so I'm low-key in love with Jay, and he knows that. Pretty sure he's gay, so it's never going to happen. But a girl can dream. Anyway, so did I invite him to contribute to the book just so I could flirt with him more? That's a question I will leave to be answered to the annals of time. Anyway, it was really important to me to include trans men because I feel like when we're talking about trans rights, often trans men are forgotten about because for like various reasons. You know, there's such a fervor about the apparent dangers of trans women. And so people kind of forget that like, trans men also exist. So it was really important for me to include that voice. I talk about trans women in part in the book, not a huge amount because there's like so much to talk about, but like I talk about things like sex and gender, and how sex and gender in science is really complicated to define. And so I talk about that in general, but then also there's some bios of trans people in history, which I find really interesting just personally, but again it's all about that normalization that I was talking about earlier. And then there is one really important fact which I include in there, which is we often talk about vaginas being self-cleaning. Neo-vaginas, or vaginas that have been created through vaginoplasties, are genuinely indistinguishable by the layperson to a vagina that a person may have been born with. So absolutely should be included in all these conversations about vulva shame. And when I talk about vulva shame, like I'm including neo-vaginas in that discussion. But self-cleaning is the one major difference in that neo-vaginas are not self-clean. And so actually, when I talk about like, you should never douche if you have a neo-vagina, actually, sometimes you do need to douche because they're not self-clean, because of the way the surgery works. Anyway, so I talk about all of those things because it's personally just really important to me and always has been. When I started the Vagina Museum in 2017, it felt like we had to have an opinion we had to like have a public opinion, is what I mean, about trans rights, because it was the sort of thing that people would ask us all the time. You know, look at the Science Museum and they're investing in fossil fuels, and they're like so weird to talk about climate change because they have all that VP money. When you're a Vagina Museum, you know, analogously, you have to have an opinion on trans rights. And when I started the Vagina Museum, like there was only one correct opinion. So it's been something that I've been doing this whole time. So thank you for asking.
I'm gonna, speaking of the Vagina Museum, just as a closing question. People can get more of you obviously at the Science Museum tomorrow. They can also get you on the Guilty Feminist podcast that came out today. Was it today?
It was today. It's this morning. I had no idea until someone tagged me an Instagram story, and I was like, oh, they did something.
Well, there you go. But you are the Vagina Museum, the Vagina Museum, you and the Vagina Museum lady.
I am I now
have a home just now for the museum, not for you. Can you tell us what's next for the museum? How do people find what you do, support what you do?
Yes.
On the journey.
Absolutely. Asking that question reminded me that I have like flyers downstairs. So if you want a flyer about how you can support us while we're closed, I will bring them up imminently. But while we're closed, I'm in searching for a new space and like going on a lot of viewings and stuff. You can, number one, donate to our crowdfunder. It's really important. We are almost entirely self-funded, and so while we're closed, like our income is taking a massive hit, and we need that to like pay salaries and stuff. Otherwise, the Vagina Museum stops existing. So contribute to our crowdfunder. You can find all the information online. Just go to our website, our social media, something like that. It'll be very difficult to find. You can share our stuff online. So share the crowdfunder, but any information about the Vagina Museum, our Twitter and our Instagram is vagina_museum. We're also on Mastodon. I don't know how you can find us there, because I don't understand Mastodon yet, but I'm sure you'll figure it out. And we're also on Tumblr, because yes, me and my colleague were those advocates in 2004. Yeah, but also just like love vulvas and support the people in your life who have vulvas.
Give it to everyone that you know that has a vulva.
Put it in the school library. Leave it on the like staff kitchen counter for everyone to look at. Leave a copy on every single bus seat.
All of those things. Your tickets for today, if you got a £4 ticket, then you get £4 off the book. If you can't afford a copy or you can't afford to get a copy for your school, then we also have a pay it forward system. So you just tell us you want to put it on pay it forward, and you can still take a book to give to someone, not yourself. And so that's it. Thanks to everyone who's watching at home. Thank you to everyone who is here with us tonight. Thank you for your brilliant questions. And will you all join me in saying a very big thank you to Florence Schechter.